Among the bound Taliban prisoners slumped against the dirt of Qala-i-Jangi sits a pale-skinned man with a Western jawline, an American citizen raised in California who abandoned his home to fight for the Taliban. CIA operatives move through the courtyard of the 60-foot-high fortress, questioning hundreds of captured fighters. It's been 6 weeks since the September 11th attacks, and somewhere in this crowd of prisoners is intelligence that could prevent the next strike on American soil. The American fighter could hold the key. But every interrogation ends the same. Quote, "We are al-Qaeda. Our loyalty is to bin Laden." Then, a Northern Alliance guard stumbles from the pink house, where hundreds more fighters are locked away. His eyes are wide with fear as he shouts a single word: "Run." Suddenly, the operatives understand. This was never a surrender. It was an ambush. The Taliban wanted to be here. Opening act. Dust whipped across the arid plains as twin-bladed helicopters descended from the mountains. Bay doors burst open the moment choppers slammed onto the cracked earth, letting out dozens of American soldiers, booted, armored, and rifles raised. From rooftops and alleyways, villagers could only stare in disbelief. Many had never seen a foreign army before, let alone a full battalion descending with such force. It was 2001, and the Americans had come to wage war against an enemy threatening to launch a series of strikes within the U.S. Their first target was Mazar-i-Sharif, a city that had been swallowed by the Taliban in a 1998 bloodbath. On October 17th, an 8-man CIA team parachuted into the Dar Yusuf Valley, meeting with General Abdul Rashid Dostum, the iron-willed Uzbek warlord commanding a key faction of the Northern Alliance. Within days, U.S. Special Forces teams arrived, and together they began sketching an assault. The goal was to liberate the North. The offensive merged war tactics from different centuries. While American operatives coordinated aerial deployments, thousands of Northern Alliance fighters surged forward, mounted on horseback, rifles slung across their backs, charging enemy lines positioned behind tanks. Despite the rudimentary approach, the Allies tore through outposts, seized control of villages, and broke the Taliban's perimeter across the region. Overhead, the American teams dropped propaganda leaflets, while radio broadcasts urged the population to rise up against the oppressors. However, when Taliban resistance stiffened and local gains stalled, the Americans understood it was time to escalate their approach. A formation of B-52 bombers darkened the sky as they rocketed toward 4,000 Taliban fighters advancing toward Mazar-i-Sharif. The bombers released their payload, giving way to the most aggressive air campaign of the war so far. The ground shook, and Taliban positions disappeared beneath curtains of smoke. Even decades later, survivors would still speak of the strike. Taliban commander Maulvi Abdul Akhundzada remembered the horror. Quote, "The bombs cut down our men like a reaper harvesting wheat." By November 9th, the situation was not good for the Taliban. From the south, Dostum's cavalry surged across the Puli Imam Bukri Bridge. American advisors called in pinpoint airstrikes as troops stormed military bases, seized the Mazar-i-Sharif International Airport, and took control of entire cities. The Taliban cracked. In retreat, their forces streamed north toward Kunduz, but the Americans and their allies would not allow them to escape so easily. The last stronghold. American bombers and fighter jets circled above Kunduz like vultures. Though the city's top Taliban commander had already defected, the fight was far from over. To fully capture Kunduz, U.S. troops needed to force every last Taliban fighter to surrender. For 11 days, payloads rained down. Precision-guided bombs struck strategic Taliban points, both inside and outside the city. 44 bunkers were reduced to ashes, tanks were torn apart, and trucks erupted into fireballs with each hit. Still, the resistance did not collapse. These weren't ordinary Afghan foot soldiers. They were foreign jihadists, elite militants from Arab, Chechen, and Uzbek factions, along with al-Qaeda operatives hardened by years of extremist warfare. To them, Kunduz wasn't just a city. It was a final stand. Many would rather give up their lives than be captured. U.S. forces and their Northern Alliance allies maintained the siege, believing the pressure would eventually force the fighters to break. But then, reports filtered in. Taliban fighters were vanishing. Intelligence suggested that hundreds, possibly thousands, were escaping, not by foot, but through the air. Roughly 2,000 militants, including top-tier al-Qaeda operatives, were believed to have been extracted from Kunduz in a covert operation now referred to as the Airlift of Evil. Pakistani aircraft allegedly flew them to safety, slipping past the siege, under circumstances that remain unclear even to this day. No government has ever officially acknowledged the airlift. Pakistan denied it. The US remained silent, but the fury within the ranks of the Northern Alliance was unmistakable. Their enemies had escaped before their eyes. They would not let this happen again. On November 25th, the siege broke. Northern Alliance troops stormed into Kunduz, kicking down doors and capturing anyone still resisting. Taliban stragglers, now leaderless and scattered, finally gave up the fight. Kunduz was taken. Trojan Horse. Western journalists swarmed the region, cameras rolling as they captured the historic moment when Taliban commanders stepped forward, solemnly giving up their arms before Northern Alliance fighters. General Abdul Rashid Dostum had made them a proposition: surrender willingly, and the Afghan-born fighters would be allowed to return to their villages. But for the foreign jihadists, there would be no such mercy. They would remain prisoners of war. With no room to bargain, the Taliban leadership accepted Dostum's terms, turning to their men and instructing, quote, "Surrender your guns in the name of the Quran." As rifles, rocket launchers, and sidearms piled at their feet, Dostum turned to his men with a curt order, quote, "Take them to Qala-i-Jangi." The compound spanned half a mile, divided into two sectors, a northern side with a single building used as an operations center, and a southern sector with multi-purpose edifications, including an armory packed with military hardware. The site had become the stronghold of the Northern Alliance, and now the intended prison for hundreds of Taliban fighters. But as the surrender unfolded and journalists approached the prisoners, something felt off. One of the captured men looked at a reporter and stated, quote, "We did not surrender." Another one declared, quote, "We are here because God ordered us to." Before the men were even done talking, an explosion ripped across the area. Smoke billowed upward as injured fighters and Northern Alliance guards lay strewn across the ground. Among them, a senior commander lay lifeless, next to the very man who had triggered the grenade that claimed them both. The Northern Alliance had miscalculated. They believed the foreign fighters would obey their commander's orders without question, and in their haste to transport the prisoners to Qala-i-Jangi, many had not been thoroughly searched for weapons. Then came another explosion. Screams, confusion, gunfire. A rebellion was starting before the men had even set foot within their cells. Dostum's men scrambled to regain control, subjugating the prisoners by force and taking them to the basement of the Pink House, one of the buildings in the southern area of the fortress that would serve as their prison. For a moment, the situation seemed under control, and the Northern Alliance allowed themselves to believe the worst had passed. It hadn't. Unusual interrogation. The following day, Americans began to arrive at Qala-i-Jangi. Among the newcomers were members of the CIA's elite Team Alpha. Leading the team was Michael Spann, a former Marine-turned-CIA officer, alongside David Tyson, an experienced linguist fluent in regional dialects. They were tasked with questioning the 400 to 600 Taliban captives held in the southern section of the complex. Somewhere in that crowd, the Americans believed, was a thread that could prevent the next attack on U.S. soil, or even lead them straight to Osama bin Laden. As they questioned the prisoners outside the Pink House, inside the basement of the building, fighters had begun their rebellion. Hidden in the seams of their garments, beneath loose tunics and in secret pockets, some prisoners still carried arms pressed against their torsos beneath their robes. With only a handful of guards watching over them, they pulled out hidden grenades and pistols and unleashed hell. Explosions tore through the compound as gunfire erupted in every direction. The so-called surrender was over. Back in the courtyard, Tyson and Spann were suddenly surrounded. Hundreds of prisoners were swarming toward them, weapons blazing, and eyes hungry for vengeance. There was no time to strategize. The agents raised their rifles and opened fire in an attempt to hold the line. Shell casings hit the floor like hail as guns hit the Taliban men and stone walls around them. But fighting was no use. They were two men standing against a tidal wave. Spann could fend off dozens of men, but the moment he ran out of ammunition, everything was over. He went down, cut by enemy fire. He became the first American casualty in combat during the Afghanistan War. Tyson froze, but there was no time to mourn. The The fortress was about to fall to the enemy, and if he stayed a moment longer, he would join Span. There was only one option left. Run. A desperate call. Tyson sprinted out of the southern sector of Qala-i-Jangi, passing the wall separating the two zones, weaving through gunfire trailing behind him. Bullets cracked past his ears, ricocheting against the ground as he raced toward the building in the northern half of the fortress. With lungs burning, Tyson vaulted over debris and pushed forward. By some miracle, he made it, his boots slamming into the floor of the building, where confused journalists and Northern Alliance fighters were waiting. The room fell silent. Dust clung to his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Everyone turned. Among the startled crowd was German journalist Arnim Stout, who immediately approached the CIA agent, seeking answers. Tyson, wide-eyed and soaked in sweat, could barely form words. Through the distant rattle of gunfire echoing through the compound, he could only gasp, quote, "There's a prison uprising." The fortress exploded into action. Northern Alliance fighters scrambled to the ramparts, overlooking the southern sector, leaning over stone parapets and opening fire on the insurgents below. Dozens of Taliban fighters fell in the first wave, their assault slowed, but not stopped. Desperate to escape the storm of bullets, the Taliban surged toward a nearby structure. Once inside, they were in disbelief. They had just stumbled into the fortress armory. For the Taliban fighters, this was a gold mine. AK-47s stacked like firewood, RPGs slung along walls, boxes of grenades and mortar shells spilling across the floor. In moments, the uprising transformed into a full-blown battle. The Taliban now had everything they needed to slaughter everyone in their path. From the northern sector, Tyson and the others looked on in horror as the only vehicle in the complex was struck by a rocket and erupted into flames. Their only way of escape was gone. Communications were down. They were trapped, pinned in the heart of a fortress-turned battlefield, with the enemy closing in fast. Tyson had no radio, no way to contact the CIA command. As gunfire crept closer, hope began to evaporate. What was meant to be a moment of triumph over the Taliban was now spiraling into disaster. Then, in a split-second decision that broke every rule of journalism, Arnim Stout stepped forward. He knew the code. Journalists do not aid intelligence officers. This wasn't a story anymore. The lives of everyone in Qala-i-Jangi were at stake. Without hesitation, he reached into his bag and handed Tyson his satellite phone. Tyson immediately grabbed it and dialed the nearest U.S. embassy. As the connection went through, he called for backup while marking out a warning that Stout still remembers clearly, quote, "Make it very clear you can't bomb the place. It's impossible to tell where the Taliban are and where we are. They're too close." Yet those listening on the other end heard a different message. The uprising had reached critical mass. If it wasn't contained fast, airstrikes would become the only option, even if it meant obliterating the fortress and everyone inside. Strike from all fronts. Shortly after Tyson's call for help, Salvation finally began to draw over the horizon, riding on horseback. Coming toward the fortress were elite ground forces composed of Green Berets from the U.S. Army Special Forces and British commandos from Z Squadron of the Special Boat Service, accompanied by fighters and T-55 tanks from the Northern Alliance. As the new troops arrived in Qala-i-Jangi, they immediately took up positions alongside the defending troops, scaling the outer walls and peering into the storm below. Inside the courtyard, Taliban fighters had turned the southern half of the fortress into a war zone. The defenders returned fire from the parapets, unleashing barrages of fire down at the enemy. But the Taliban fighters held their ground. Hours passed, and the battle only intensified. The Taliban, fueled by fanatic resolve, refused to fall back. Ground forces alone would not be enough. It was time for the Americans to unleash their full force. Despite the close quarters and the risk of friendly fire, the call went out. Bring in the jets. The target was Qala-i-Jangi's armory. If it could be destroyed, the rebels would lose their advantage. Overhead, the air hummed as two Navy Fa-18 Hornets banked toward the fortress. From the northern sector, Tyson, Stout, and the other men in the building watched as the jet zeroed, fearing that their payloads would find them instead of the enemy. The first bomb fell. Journalist Alex Perry, positioned just outside the blast zone, saw it fall. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then everything erupted. The detonation rocked the fortress like an earthquake, sending a shockwave so powerful The Perry later recalled, quote, "Everyone passed out for a millisecond." But as the dust cleared, the armory still stood. The bomb had missed its target. The jets returned again and again, dropping payloads meant to obliterate the Taliban's last stronghold. Some fighters scattered and took shelter in the basement of the Pink House. And still, with every strike, the armory remained intact. Outside the complex, more journalists began to arrive, drawn by the battle. They clustered near the outer walls, dodging gunfire and trying to capture one of the war's most savage firefights as they whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the mayhem. No one could agree on what exactly was happening, even when they managed to catch up with one of the defenders around the complex. As journalist Alessio Vinci put it, quote, "Each fighter at the scene had a different story to tell." Tyson and the others trapped inside the fortress understood victory was nowhere in sight. Escaping Qala-i-Jangi. The only way out of the fortress was through the main gate, now deep inside Taliban-controlled territory, crawling with fighters and ready to cut down anyone who approached. There was no way Tyson and his men could reach the exit alive. But then the CIA agent noticed something. Some of the Afghans had found another way out, through the rooftop. They were sprinting across a narrow, exposed span of wall that cut above the line of fire. It was a gamble, an open-air dash in full view of Taliban gunmen, but at the end of that path, a ridge offered a drop-off to the outside of the fortress. From their perch, the CIA agent watched as men took their chances, darting across the rooftop one by one. Some made it, others didn't. Still, it was the only chance they had. Tyson gave the order. One after another, they ran. Armin Stouth would later remember the moment his turn came. The sound of bullets whipping past his ears, the pounding in his chest, the countdown. Then came Tyson. He bolted forward, feet pounding the rooftop, heart racing. He made it across, dropped over the ledge, and scaled down the 60-foot fortress wall. Once the men had escaped, the survivors dashed into the open terrain beyond Qala-i-Jangi, the sound of gunfire and explosions still echoing behind them. Then, out of nowhere, Tyson spotted a van barreling down the nearby road. He raised his rifle, not to fire, but to stop it. The driver hit the brakes. Without hesitation, Tyson and the others piled in. The vehicle became their salvation, whisking them away from the burning fortress behind. Their escape came at the exact right moment, because the fortress was about to erupt again. Back at Qala-i-Jangi, American and Northern Alliance forces launched their most brutal assault yet. General Dostum ordered tanks and mortars to pummel the northern gate, while US and British forces called in the heaviest payload available, a GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition. It was a monster, 2,000 pounds, 4 times heavier than the bombs that had been dropped up until that point. This time, pilots had their sights set on the Pink House, where most of the Taliban fighters were believed to be holed up. An F-18C Hornet hovered overhead, releasing the JDAM. The shockwave was so intense that soldiers outside the walls hit the dirt, shielding themselves from flying shrapnel. The payload had struck the fortress, but something had gone wrong. The bomb didn't hit the Pink House. It landed in the northern sector, near the very building where the CIA officer and journalists had taken shelter before their escape. The blast tore through the Allied ranks, even flipping some of the Allied tanks in the complex. The bomb even reached Northern Alliance fighters. Had Tyson and the others remained, they likely would have been among the casualties. The hit was so severe that panic spread through Dostum's men. Convinced more bombs were coming, they began to flee the fortress, abandoning their positions. Now the defenders understood that air support alone would not win the battle, and the only way to defeat the resilient Taliban fighters in Qala-i-Jangi would be through vicious close-quarters combat. The fortress must fall. As the days dragged on, the battle inside Qala-i-Jangi only became more violent. Man-to-man combat became the norm across the grounds of the fortress. The conditions of the fighters had deteriorated after a relentless battle with no food or shelter from the weather, but none of it mattered. The Taliban fighters were determined to keep the fight alive. They surged across the scorched courtyard with rifles raised and grenades clenched, darting behind the barest of cover, sometimes nothing more than felled tree trunks or debris. With each charge, they moved across the rubble, trying to get within striking distance of the Northern Alliance defenders. The carnage was unspeakable. Chaos reigned supreme, with bullets coming from all directions, and no one was able to tell friend from foe. Soldiers ran for cover. Journalists scrambled across unknown terrain as they kept their cameras rolling. Survival was the only objective. Then came the final counteroffensive. The Northern Alliance brought in reinforcements, tanks, and armored vehicles that rolled into position. Their turrets locked onto enemy strongholds, and one by one, they opened fire. For hours, the thunder of tank shells echoed through the fortress. And then, silence at last. No more gunfire, no more movement. The defenders dared to hope the fortress had finally been secured. With the battle seemingly over, General Dostum arrived to assess the wreckage. He ordered the clearing of what was left of his shattered stronghold. But as the men descended into the basement beneath the Pink House, the same place where the rebellion had ignited, gunfire rang out again. From the shadows of the underground, nearly 100 Taliban fighters had survived. Battered and bloodied, they had turned the basement into their final holdout. Attempts to descend were met with a hail of bullets. Dostum called down for surrender. Nothing. The holdouts refused to yield. Not now. Not ever. For the next day, the general and his commanders devised a plan. They needed to get the last fighter out, but there could be no more pointless sacrifice of Northern Alliance men. No man would be ordered into the basement. Then, a bold plan emerged. At dawn, Dostum's men moved into place. Instead of bullets, they unleashed water, cold and endless. Slowly, the basement began to flood. The frigid surge crept upward, forcing the fighters from their hiding places. Soaked and shivering, they scrambled for air, dropping their weapons and clawing their way to the exit. Finally, after days of combat, the last Taliban fighter emerged. The last gun was silenced in the Battle of Qala-i-Jangi. One of the most violent episodes of the early war in Afghanistan had come to an end. Shadow over victory. No one knows for certain how many Taliban fighters lost their lives in the uprising at Qala-i-Jangi. But when the dust finally settled, only 86 prisoners remained alive from the hundreds initially captured. Among the survivors was John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban. Upon being recaptured, he was flown back to the United States, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for aiding a foreign terrorist organization. The cost was devastating for the local forces who helped suppress the revolt. An estimated 73 Northern Alliance soldiers were lost in action, with more than 250 wounded during the firefight in the fortress. Though technically a victory, the battle left a stain on America's early success in Afghanistan. It shattered the illusion that the war would be swift or bloodless, and what many had hoped would be a short intervention became the longest war in American history. 20 years, over 2,400 U.S. military losses, hundreds of thousands of civilian and combatant casualties, and over $2 trillion spent. For CIA officer David Tyson and the others who survived Qala-i-Jangi, the horror didn't end with the final gunshot. The memories only grew heavier with time, especially after the 2021 American withdrawal, when Taliban forces swept back into power, reclaiming the country that had once seemed on the brink of liberation. In recent interviews, Tyson has spoken about the fate of their former allies, revealing that many of the Northern Alliance fighters who risked their lives fighting beside Americans are now being persecuted by the Taliban. Tyson, like many veterans of that early campaign, refuses to leave his former allies alone, working alongside officials to help get them out of the country. As he put it, quote, "Their lives are under constant threat because of their partnership with us. What I can't do as a person is abandon and forget, and what we can't do as people is abandon and forget."